Hi everyone, I'm Zara Jade Malong from Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Science. In today's video, you will learn about respiratory system. So I will discuss to you the anatomy and physiology of respiratory system, its parts, its functions, its structures, and mechanisms together with Mr. Shagal Balasabas. So listen attentively so that you can be able to understand well and absorb every information and details that I'll give to you. So before we start our discussion, I want you to sit back and relax. Follow me. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Now what did you observe? Thus inhalation is when we take in air. Exhalation is when we give out air. They are the basic process of breathing. The processes of inspiration or breathing in and expiration or breathing out are vital for providing oxygen to tissues and removing carbon dioxide from the body. Breathing is one of the most important functions of respiratory system. So I will not further discuss its mechanism of action because I am going to focus on the anatomy and physiology of respiratory system. So what is respiratory system? The respiratory system is the organs and other parts of your body involved in breathing when you exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. The respiratory system is the network of organs and tissues that help you breathe. It includes your airways, lungs, and blood vessels. The muscles that power your lungs are also part of the respiratory system. These parts work together to move oxygen throughout the body and clean out waste gases like carbon dioxide. So respiratory system helps us to breathe and be alive. Thus, it is so impossible in humans without respiratory system. Will not work and impossible to be alive. So what are the functions of respiratory system? It oversees gas exchanges like oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood internal environment. Its exchange gases takes place within the lungs in the alveoli, only site of gas exchange. Other structures passageways to the lungs purify, warm, and humidify the incoming air. It also shares responsibility with cardiovascular system, and the respiratory system has many functions. Besides helping you inhale or breathe in and exhale or breathe out, it allows also to talk and to smell. Warms air to match your body temperature and moisturizes it to the humidity level of your body needs. It delivers oxygen to the cells in your body, removes waste gases including carbon dioxide from the body when you exhale. It also protects your airways from harmful substances and irritants. So there are major parts of respiratory system. In humans, first is the nose. It allows air to enter your body, then filters the breeze and warms and moistens the air. Your nose gives you a sense of smell and helps shape your appearance. Next is the pharynx. The pharynx, usually called the throat, is a part of respiratory system and digestive system. It carries air, food, and fluid down from the nose and the mouth. The pharynx is the site of common illnesses, including sore throat and tonsillitis. Next is the larynx. It is a hollow tube that connects your throat or pharynx to the rest of your respiratory system. It helps you swallow safely and contains the vocal cords, so it's often called the voice box. Next is the trachea. It is a long tube that connects your larynx or voice box to your bronchi. Next is the bronchi. What is bronchi? The bronchi are the two large tubes that carry air from your windpipe to your lungs. Next is the lungs. Your lungs are part of respiratory system. It is a group of organs and tissues work together to help you breathe. And the alveoli. The alveoli are where the lungs and blood exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide during the process of breathing in and breathing out. The respiratory system has upper and lower parts. The upper respiratory tract or upper airways consist of the nose, mouth, sinuses, pharynx or the upper section of the throat, and the larynx or the voice box. While the lower respiratory tract consists of the trachea or windpipe, bronchial tubes, and the lungs. So I will discuss it later one by one, the anatomy, structures, its parts and functions to make the respiratory system works. So listen attentively so that you can catch up every details that I'll give to you. The human respiratory system can again be classified on what we call conducting zone and respiratory zone. When we say conducting zone, it consists of a series of interconnecting cavities and tubes both outside and within the lungs. These include the nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and terminal bronchioles. The major function of the conducting zone are to provide a route for incoming outgoing air. It removes debris and pathogens from the incoming air and warm and humidify the incoming air. Several structures within the conducting zone perform other functions as well. While the respiratory zone consists of tubes and tissues within the lungs where gas exchange occurs. These include the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and alveoli, where gas exchange occur in these zones. Respiratory zone. So the respiratory zone is found deep inside the lungs and is made up of the respiratory bronchioles. These thin-walled structures allow inhaled oxygen to diffuse into the lung capillaries in the exchange for carbon dioxide. So let's start with the nose. What is the nose? It is the external nasal anatomy is quite simple. It is a pyramidal structure with its root located superiorly and apex sitting inferiorly. The root is continuous with the anterior surface of the head, and the part between the root and the apex is called the dorsum of the nose. Inferior to the apex are the two nearest nostrils, which are the openings to the nasal cavity. The nares are separated by the nasal septum and laterally bounded by the alanae or wings of the nostrils. The external nose is comprised of both bony and cartilaginous components. The bony part shapes the nose root, formed by the nasal, maxillae, and the frontal bones. The cartilaginous part is located inferiorly and is comprised of several alar, 2 lateral, and 1 septal cartilage. First is the alar cartilage. Major alar cartilage forms the apex of the nose. Minor alar cartilages support the alanae. Next is lateral processes of the septal cartilage form the dorsum of the nose. Then the septal cartilage bounds the nares medially. Note that the septal cartilage is attached to both the bony nasal septum, which is actually the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and the vomer bone. Both nasal septum and vomer are bony parts of the internal nose. So what is the function of your nose? Your nose is involved in several important bodily functions. First, it allows air to enter your body. Then it contributes to how you look and how you sound when you speak. Then it filters and cleans air to remove particles and allergens. Next is it provides a sense of smell, and it warms and moistens air so it can move comfortably into your respiratory system. So what is respiratory mucosa? Respiratory mucosa is a layer of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells that secrete mucus. It is found in the nose, sinuses, pharynx, larynx, and trachea. Mucus can trap contaminants. Glands in the nasal mucosa produce a sticky mucus which moistens air and traps bacteria as they enter the respiratory passage. Then the cilia, it moves mucus up towards the mouth. Cilia, or small hairs, would project from the epithelium and line the nasal mucosa, create motions which drain mucus from the nasal passage to the throat, from where it is swallowed and digested by the stomach juices. The activity level of cilia is dependent on the temperature, and in cold temperature, cilia become less active. Mucus may accumulate in and drip from the nostrils or runny nose in these conditions. Infectious particles and allergens also impair cilia activity and can lead to symptoms such as a congested or runny nose. The nasal mucosa, also called respiratory mucosa, lines the entire nasal cavity from the nostrils, or the external openings of the respiratory system, to the pharynx, or the uppermost section of the throat. The external skin of the nose connects to the nasal mucosa in the nasal vestibule. A dynamic layer of mucus overlies the nasal epithelium, or the outermost layer of cells of the nasal mucosa. The posterior two-thirds of the cavity is lined with pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium. It is a type of epithelium in which cells arrange themselves in columns and project tiny hairs called cilia, containing goblet cells, or the mucus producing cells, and which overlies a basement membrane. Next is the nasal cavity. So what is nasal cavity? It refers to the interior of the nose, or the structure which opens exteriorly of the nostrils. It is the entry point for inspired air and the first of a series of structures which form the respiratory system. The cavity is entirely lined by the nasal mucosa. One of the anatomical structure other includes skin, body encasements like the skull, and non-nasal mucosa such as those of the vagina and bowel, which form the physical barriers of the body's immune system. These barriers provide mechanical protection from the invasion of infectious and allergenic pathogens. The nasal cavity extends from the external opening, the nostrils, to the pharynx, or the upper section of the throat, where it joins the remainder of the respiratory system. It is separated down the middle by the nasal septum, a piece of cartilage which shapes and separates the nostrils. Each nostril can be further divided into roof, floor, and walls. The nasal cavity can be divided into the vestibule, respiratory, and olfactory sections. So let's start with the vestibule. What is vestibule? It is the shape of the nasal cavity is complex. In the blue color of the photo, we can see the vestibule, the forward section within above each nostril. It is called the vestibule. Behind the vestibule and along each outer wall are three elevations running generally from front to rear. Each elevation, called a nasal concha or turbinate, hangs over an air passage. Next is the respiratory sections. The rest of the cavity is the respiratory portion. The respiratory area is lined with a moist mucous membrane with fine hair-like projections known as cilia, which serve to collect debris. Mucus from cells in the membrane wall also helps to trap particles of dust, carbon, soot, and bacteria. Sinus cavities are located in the bony skull on both sides of the nose. Next is olfactory sections. So what are olfactory sections? In the green color of the image, as you can see, is the olfactory or smelling portion of the nose. Most of the lining is a mucous membrane. It is a small segment of the lining contains the nerve cells that are actually sensory organs. Fibers called dendrites, which project from the nerve cells into the nasal cavity, are covered only by a thin layer of moisture. Next is the olfactory epithelium. The olfactory epithelium found within the nasal cavity contains olfactory receptor cells, which have specialized cilia extensions. The cilia trap other molecules as they pass across the epithelial surface. Information about the molecules is then transmitted from the receptors to the olfactory bulb in the brain. Next is the paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are air-filled extensions of the nasal cavity. There are 4 paired sinuses named according to the bone in which they are located. As you can see on the photo, the maxillary, frontal, sphenoid, and ethmoid. Each sinus is lined by a ciliated pseudostratified epithelium interspersed with the mucus-secreting goblet cells. Paranasal sinuses functions is first lightening the weight of the head, supporting immune defense of the nasal cavity, humidifying inspired air, and increasing resonance of the voice. The paranasal sinuses are formed during development by the nasal cavity eroding into the surrounding bones. All the sinuses therefore drain back into the nasal cavity. Openings to the paranasal sinuses can be found on the roof and lateral nasal walls. Let's start with the frontal sinus. There are 2 frontal sinuses located within the frontal bone of the skull. They are the most superior of the paranasal sinuses and are triangular in shape. The front nasal duct and supraorbital nerve. Drainage is via the front nasal duct. It opens out the hiatus semilunaris within the middle mucus of the nasal cavity. While sensation is applied by the supraorbital nerve, it is a branch of the ophthalmic nerve. An anterior supply is via the anterior ethmoidal artery. It is a branch of the internal carotid. Next is the ethmoidal sinuses. There are 3 ethmoidal sinuses located within the ethmoid bone. First is the anterior. It opens onto the hiatus semilunaris, or the middle mucus. Next is the middle, opens onto the lateral wall of the middle meatus. Next is the posterior. It opens onto the lateral wall of the superior meatus. They are innervated by the anterior and posterior ethmoidal branches of the nasociliary nerve and the maxillary nerve. The anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries are responsible for arterial supply. The maxillary sinuses are the largest of the sinuses. They are located laterally and slightly inferiorly to the nasal cavities. They drain into the nasal cavity as the hiatus semilunaris underneath the frontal sinus opening. This is a potential pathway for spread of infection. Fluid draining from the frontal sinus can enter the maxillary sinus. Next is the sphenoid sinus. The sphenoid sinuses are situated within the body of the sphenoid bone. They open out into the nasal cavity in an area superior-posterior to the superior concha known as the sphenoethmoidal recess. They are innervated by the posterior ethmoidal nerve. It is a branch of the ophthalmic nerve and branches of the maxillary nerve. Next, let's proceed to the pharynx. The pharynx is a muscular tube that connects the oral and nasal cavity to the larynx and esophagus. It begins at the base of the skull and ends at the inferior border of the cercoid cartilage. The pharynx is comprised of 3 parts, superior to inferior. First is the nasopharynx, second is the oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So first, what is nasopharynx? Your nasopharynx is the top part of your throat or pharynx. It's a muscular, box-shaped passageway behind your nose, just above the roof of your mouth. Your nasopharynx allows air to pass from your nose into your windpipe and eventually into your lungs. Let me inform you that the size of your nasopharynx varies among people. It's about 2 centimeters in diameter and 4 centimeters long. So what is the function of nasopharynx? The main function of your nasopharynx is to connect your nasal passages to the rest of your respiratory system. This allows air to get from your nose to your lungs. Your nasopharynx also helps controls pressure between your nasopharynx and middle ear and It filters dust, debris, and germs out of the air you breathe. It also produces your voice. So where is your nasopharynx located? Your nasopharynx is located toward the bottom and back of your skull. It's in the back of your nose and the roof of your mouth. The top of your nasopharynx connects to your nasal cavity. The bottom connects to your oropharynx or the middle throat, leading to your hypopharynx or the lower throat, trachea, and eventually the lungs. So what does the nasopharynx contain? Your nasopharynx involves several important structures. First is the eustachian tubes. These tubes run from the middle of your ears to your nasopharynx. They equalize air pressure and drain fluid from your air. And then the adenoids or the nasopharyngeal tonsils. These glands are part of your immune system and help protect your body from viruses and bacteria. And next is the anatomy of the oropharyngeal. The oropharynx serves both the respiratory and digestive systems. The oropharynx is the critical region that joins the oral cavity and nasopharynx within the larynx and hypopharynx. It contains the following structures. First is the soft palate. The soft palate plays an essential role in blocking food and other substances from entering the nasal passages during swallowing and is the most important in the formation of certain sounds and speech production. As you can see in the photo in the upper section. Cleft lip and cleft lip and cleft palate are the common congenital abnormalities in this section. Next is the pharyngeal wall. The posterior pharyngeal wall is the back wall of the swallowing passage. The upper part of the posterior pharyngeal wall can be seen when one looks through an open mouth beyond the soft palate, uvula, and the tonsils. There is a layer of mucosa, then muscle, and then the bodies of the cervical vertebrae. Next is the tonsillar pillar. The anterior tonsillar pillar is formed by the palatogloccus muscle, and the posterior pillar is formed by the palatopharyngeus muscle. The anterior pillar is posterior to the retromolar trigone. Next is the palatine tonsils. The palatine tonsils are the ones that are located near the opening of the oral cavity into the pharynx. The function of the palatine tonsils is thought to be associated with preventing infection in the respiratory and digestive tracts by producing antibodies that help kill infective agents. Next is the base of the tongue. For swallowing, the base of tongue is under medullary control in the central nervous system. During swallowing, both the oral tongue and the base of the tongue are the most important generators of pressure to drive food through the oral cavity and the pharynx and into the esophagus. And last part of pharynx is laryngopharynx. So what is laryngopharynx? It is where both food and the air pass. It can be found between the hyoid bone and the larynx and esophagus, which helps guide food and air where to go. It is part of the pharynx. A smooth mucous membrane covers the side back walls. At the back of the larynx, the anterior wall of the laryngopharynx exists. Next is the larynx. So larynx, or what we call voice box, is an organ located in the anterior neck. It is a component of the respiratory tract and has several important functions, including phonation, the cough reflex, and protection of the lower respiratory tract. The structure of larynx is primarily cartilaginous and is held together by a series of ligaments and membranes. Internally, the laryngeal muscles move components of the larynx for phonation and breathing. Posterior to the larynx is the esophagus. This is of clinical relevance during emergency intubation, as pressure can be applied to the cricoid cartilage of the larynx to occlude the esophagus and thus prevent regurgitation of gastric contents. The larynx is formed by a cartilaginous skeleton which held together by ligaments and membranes. The laryngeal muscles act to move the components of the larynx for phonation and breathing. Anatomically, the internal cavity of the larynx can be divided into three sections. The supraglottis, from the inferior surface of the epiglottis to the vestibular folds or false vocal cords. The second one is the glottis. It contains vocal cords and 1 centimeter below them. The opening between the vocal cords is known as the rema glottis, the size of which is altered by the muscles of phonation. Then the subglottis. From inferior border of the glottis to the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage, the anterior surface of the larynx is lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. An important exception to this is the true vocal cords, which are lined by a stratified squamous epithelium. The arterial supply to the larynx is via the superior and inferior laryngeal arteries. First, the superior laryngeal artery. It is a branch of the superior thyroid artery or derived from the external carotid. It follows the internal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve into the larynx. Second is inferior laryngeal artery, a branch of the inferior thyroid artery derived from the thyrocervical trunk. It follows the recurrent laryngeal nerve into the larynx. The venous drainage is by the superior and inferior laryngeal veins. The superior laryngeal veins drains the internal jugular vein via the superior thyroid, whereas the inferior laryngeal vein drains to the left brachiocephalic vein via the inferior thyroid vein. Larynx receives both motor and sensory innervation via branches of the vagus nerve. The recurrent laryngeal nerve, it provides sensory innervation to the infraglottis and motor innervation to all the internal muscles of larynx, except the cricothyroid. The superior laryngeal nerve, it is the internal branch, provides sensory innervation to the supraglottis. An external branch provides motor innervation to the cricothyroid muscle. Next is the vocal cords. So what is the vocal cords? The vocal cords are responsible for the production of speech. Their movement is controlled by intrinsic muscles of the larynx, or the majority of which are innervated by recurrent laryngeal nerve. An exception is the cricothyroid muscle, innervated by the external laryngeal nerve. So there are cartilages found in the larynx. So what are these cartilages? First is the thyroid cartilage. As you can see in the image, this structure wraps around the front and sides of the uppermost part of the larynx. The thyroid cartilage also forms the Adam's apple. Next is epiglottis. This structure attaches to the thyroid cartilage's inner surface, covering the top opening of the larynx. Next is the cricoid cartilage. This structure is also known as the cricoid ring. It forms a closed circle at the bottom of the larynx. And next is the arytenoid cartilage. It is a pair of flexible pyramid-shaped cartilages that cover the back part of the cricoid cartilage, and they support the vocal cords. Next is the corniculate cartilages. These structures are small cone-shaped cartilages that sit on the tips of the arytenoid cartilages. So aside from the cartilages, there are also ligaments and membranes found in the larynx. So the ligaments and membranes in the larynx include extrinsic ligaments and membranes. These ligaments and membranes attach the upper portion of the larynx to the hyoid bone and the lower part to the trachea. They sit on the outside of the larynx. Next is the intrinsic ligaments and membranes. So when we say intrinsic ligaments and membranes, these ligaments and membranes form internal connections between the various structures of cartilage that form the larynx. Next is the mucous membrane. So when we say mucous membrane, it lines the inner surface of the larynx. Next is the anatomy of the trachea. The trachea or windpipe is a 10 to 11 centimeter long fibrocartilaginous tube of the lower respiratory tract. It forms the trunk of the tracheobronchial tree or pulmonary conducting zone. The trachea extends between the larynx and thorax, consisting of two parts. First is cervical, which is located inside the anterior visceral or pretracheal compartment of the neck. It begins at the inferior border of the larynx or cricoid cartilage located at the level of vertebra 6. Next is the thoracic part, which is located in the superior mediastinum of the thorax. It begins from the superior thoracic aperture and ends of the tracheal bifurcation. The bifurcation can be located anywhere between the levels of the 4th and 7th thoracic vertebrae. Next is the trachea and bronchi. The trachea and bronchi collectively form the tracheobronchial tree. The thoracic part divides at the tracheal bifurcation into the right and left main bronchi. The tracheal bifurcation houses a sagittally oriented cartilaginous ridge called the carina. Take note that the right main bronchus is shorter, wider, and courses almost vertically compared to the left one. Therefore, it is more susceptible to foreign body obstructions. Each main bronchus divides into increasingly smaller intrapulmonary bronchi that supply the lungs. The lobar bronchi, it is the transport air towards the pulmonary lobes. The segmental bronchi, which aerate the bronchopulmonary segments. On the right side, the three lobar bronchi divide into a total of 10 to 12 segmental bronchi, one for each bronchopulmonary segment. Then the intrasegmental bronchi, which transport air even deeper within the bronchopulmonary segments. Each segmental bronchi provides approximately 15 intrasegmental bronchi. So what is the anatomy of trachea? The trachea extends between the larynx and thorax, roughly occupying the midline. It is slightly tilted to the left, and it is divided into 4 parts. So in the cervical part of the trachea, which is located inside the anterior visceral or pretracheal compartment of the neck. So the trachea is related to many anatomical structures as it travels between the neck and mediastinum. The cervical part of the trachea is covered anteriorly by several structures, from deep to superficial. So let's start with the visceral cervical fascia. It is an important function of the cervical fascia is to guide against the spread of pus and debris resulting from disease or abnormal tissues. These layers of the deep cervical fascia also function to support the viscera of the neck. Examples: the thyroid gland, muscles, blood and lymphatic vessels, and the deep lymph nodes. So next is the isthmus of the thyroid gland, which crosses the trachea between the 2nd and 4th tracheal cartilages. The inferior thyroid arteries are located superior to the isthmus. The pretracheal fascia, inferior thyroid veins, and thymus are located inferior to the isthmus. So what is the structure of the thyroid gland? The thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland located in the throat or neck region, just below the Adam's apple. If you wish to know the exact thyroid gland location, then note that the gland is located on the anterior part of the neck, near the trachea and larynx. So the thyroid gland is wrapped around the windpipe. So what is the functions? What are the functions of the thyroid gland? First, it releases and maintains hormone levels in the body. Then it regulates growth and development of the body. It develops of the central nervous system. And then it regulates lipid metabolism of your body. And this regulates body temperatures. So next part of the cervical part of trachea is called pretracheal lymph nodes. Paratracheal lymph nodes run along the sides of your trachea or windpipe in the neck. These are the lymph nodes that often become swollen when you're sick with a sore throat or cold. So lymph nodes are an important part of your body's immune system, and where they're sore or swollen, this may signal a serious conditions, including cancer. So next is the sternoid and sternothyroid muscle. So what are this? The sternothyroid muscle, also called the sternothyroidus, is in the neck area. The muscle goes from the sternum or breastbone to the edge of the thyroid cartilage. The sternothyroid muscle is shorter and wider than the sternoid muscle. The sternothyroid muscle lies underneath the sternoid muscle. Nerves from the upper cervical nerve travel through the cervical ansa or cervical loop and supply the sternothyroid muscle. So let's move on to thoracic part of the trachea. So the thoracic part of the trachea has several relations as it travels within the superior mediastinum. It begins from the superior thoracic aperture and ends at the tracheal bifurcation. The bifurcation can be located anywhere between the levels of the 4th and 7th thoracic vertebrae. The esophagus remains posteriorly to the thoracic part of the trachea. In addition, the lateral relations of the thoracic part are different on the right and left sides. So on the right side, the trachea is related to the right vagus nerve, right brachiocephalic vein, superior vena cava, and azygos vein. On the left side, the trachea is neighbored by the aortic arch, left recurrent laryngeal nerve, left common carotid artery, and left subclavian artery. So what are the functions of the trachea? The blood supply and innervation. So the trachea is supplied with arterial blood by tracheal branches of inferior thyroid arteries that stem from the thyrocervical trunk. Venous blood is drained to the inferior thyroid venous plexus, which empties into the brachiocephalic veins. The lymphatic drainage is to the petracheal and paratracheal or cervical or thoracic lymph nodes that empty into the deep cervical lymph nodes. And the trachea is part of the conducting zone of the respiratory system. Its main function is to transport oxygenated air from the upper respiratory tract towards the alveoli for gas exchange. The resulting carbon dioxide filled air is transported by the tracheobronchial system towards the oral cavity and nose for excretion. Next, let's proceed to the lungs. The lungs, which is the organ for respiration, is a paired cone-shaped organs lying in the thoracic cavity, separated from each other by the heart and other structures in the mediastinum. So each lung has a base resting on the diaphragm and an apex extending superiorly to a point approximately 2.5 cm superior to the clavicle. It also has a medial surface and with 3 borders: anterior, posterior, and inferior. The broad costal surface of the lungs is pressed against the rib cage, while the smaller mediastinal surface faces medially. The lungs receives the bronchus, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves through a slit in the mediastinal surface, called the hilum. And the structures entering the hilum constitutes the lung's root. The right lung is larger and weighs more than the left lung. Each lung is invested by and enclosed in a serous pleural sac that consists of two continuous membranes. The visceral or pulmonary pleura invest the lungs. So let's start with the parietal pleura. It is lined the pulmonary cavities and adhere to the thoracic wall, mediastinum, and diaphragm. The parietal pleura consists of 4 parts. Costal at this point, the oxygen molecules move through a single layer of lung cells in the alveolus, then through a single cell layer in a capillary to enter the bloodstream. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of the process in cells that uses oxygen to produce energy. As oxygen moves out of the alveolus, carbon dioxide molecules pass into it. We are then breathed out of the body through the nose or mouth. Pleura, which lines the internal surface of the thoracic wall. Mediastinal pleura, which lines the lateral aspect of the mediastinum. Diaphragmatic pleura, which lines the superior surface of the diaphragm on each side of the mediastinum. Cervical pleura extends through the superior thoracic aperture into the root of the neck, forming a cup-shaped dome over the apex of the lung. The pleural cavity is the potential space between the visceral and parietal layers of the pleural, and it contains a capillary layer of serous pleural fluid which lubricates the pleural surfaces and allows the layers to slide smoothly over each other during respiration. Surface tension created by the pleural cavity provides the cohesion that keeps the lung surface in contact with the thoracic wall. So each lung is divided into lobes by fissures. So both lungs have oblique fissure, and the right is further divided by a transverse fissure. The oblique fissure in the left lung separates the superior and the inferior lobe. The oblique and horizontal fissure divides the lungs into superior, middle, and inferior lobes. Thus, the right lung has 3 lobes, while the left has 2. So each lobe is supplied by a lobar bronchus. So the lobes are subdivided by bronchopulmonary segments, which are supplied by the segmental bronchi. Tracheobronchial tree. All the respiratory passages from the trachea to the respiratory bronchioles are called the tracheobronchial tree. So what is tracheobronchial tree? The trachea divides at the external angle into the right and left primary bronchus, which goes into the right and left lungs. So each bronchus enters the lungs at a notch called the hilum. Blood vessels and nerves also connect with the lungs here and together with the bronchus from a region called the root of the lungs. So the primary function of the lung is the exchange of gases between the body and the environment. The lungs contain a series of narrowing passageways that terminate into tiny sacs called alveoli. So during respiration, oxygen enters the lungs by diffusion through the capillaries surrounding each alveolar sac. The lungs are the major organs of the respiratory system and are divided into sections or lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes and is slightly larger than the left lung, which has 2 lobes. So I've discussed it earlier. The lungs are separated by the mediastinum. This area contains the heart, trachea, esophagus, and many lymph nodes. The lungs are covered by a protective membrane known as the pleura and are separated from the abdominal cavity by the muscular diaphragm. So let's proceed to the anatomy of bronchioles. So bronchioles are air passages inside the lungs that branch off the 3 limes from the bronchi. The 2 main air passages into which air flows from trachea or windpipe after being inhaled through the nose or mouth. The bronchioles deliver air to tiny sacs called alveoli, where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. They are vulnerable to conditions like asthma, bronchiolitis, cystic fibrosis, and emphysema that can cause constriction and obstruction of the airways. So bronchioles are air passages inside the lungs that branch off like 3 limes from the bronchi. The 2 main air passages into which air flows from the trachea or windpipe after being inhaled through the nose or mouth. The bronchioles deliver air to tiny sacs called alveoli where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. So there are 3 types categorized by size. The lobular bronchioles, it is larger passages that first enter the lobes of the lungs. Then the respiratory bronchioles, 2 or more branches from each terminal bronchiole that in turn lead to 10 alveolar ducts. Then the terminal bronchioles, which is 50 to 80 smaller passages in each lung. Next, the alveoli. Alveoli are an important part of the respiratory system. The respiratory system is the part of your body that helps you breathe. Alveoli are tiny, balloon-shaped air sacs. Their job is to move oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules into and out of your bloodstream. Alveoli are the end point of the respiratory system. The respiratory process starts when you inhale air into your mouth or nose. So the air travels down the trachea, also called the windpipe. Then the air travels through airways called the bronchi and into the lungs. From there, the air is directed through smaller and smaller passages called bronchioles. The air moves through a tiny duct called the alveolar duct and finally enters an individual alveolus. So alveoli are lined by a fluid called surfactant. This fluid maintains the shape of the air sac and helps keep it open so that oxygen and carbon dioxide can pass. Similarly, carbon dioxide moves the other way because the concentration of carbon dioxide is lower in the alveoli than in the capillaries. So now I am going to explain to you the process called the gaseous exchange. So the gaseous exchange, so what is this? So the pharynx or throat receives air through the mouth or nose and immediately passes through the pharynx. It then enters the trachea after passing through the larynx or voice box. The trachea is a robust tube that is protected from collapsing by cartilage rings. The trachea splits into two left and right bronchus within the lungs. These are further divided into bronchioles, which are smaller branches. The bronchioles that are the smallest and in tiny air sacs. These are referred to as alveoli. When a person inhales, they expand, and when they exhale, they deflate. Oxygen is transferred from the lungs to the bloodstream during gas exchange, and carbon dioxide is transported from the bloodstream to the lungs at the same moment. This occurs in the lungs, between the alveoli and a network of microscopic blood arteries known as capillaries, which are found in the alveoli walls. Red blood cells are seen passing through the capillaries. The alveolar walls and capillary walls share a membrane. This allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to readily pass from the respiratory system to the bloodstream. Oxygen molecules bind to red blood cells as they return to the heart. At the same time, when a person exhales, the carbon dioxide molecules in the alveoli are blown out of the body. The body uses gas exchange to replenish oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. It is vital to do both in order to survive. So oxygenated blood travels from the lungs through the pulmonary veins and into the left side of the heart, which pumps the blood to the rest of the body. Oxygen-deficient carbon dioxide-rich blood returns to the right sides of the heart through two large veins, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Then the blood is pumped through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. So that is all about my topic for today about respiratory system. So I hope that you understand well and you absorb the lessons, each structures, each parts and functions, the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system, how it works. So the other topics left will be discussed to you by Mark partner, Ms. Balasabas. So thank you everyone for listening.